The day started like any other, but it ended in a way I never could have predicted. The morning of my wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. I should have been filled with excitement, anticipation, maybe even a bit of nervousness. But something felt off. Emma, my soon-to-be wife, had been distant for weeks, more than just the typical wedding jitters. Every time I tried to ask her what was wrong, she brushed it off, saying it was just stress. I believed her, at first. The ceremony went by in a blur, but there was one moment that stood out to me, a moment that would replay in my head for months to come. During the reception, amidst the laughter and chatter, I stepped outside to catch my breath. That's when I saw them. Emma and Marcus, our gardener, standing by the rose bushes. His hand brushed against her arm in a way that wasn't casual. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her face softening, her usual tension melting away in his presence. For a split second, I saw it. Their lips met, just for a brief moment, but it was enough to send a shockwave through my entire body. My heart pounded, and I felt the world around me shift. This wasn't just a friendly interaction. Something more was happening here, something that had been brewing for longer than I cared to admit. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth. Marcus wasn't just some handyman who took care of our garden. He had a past, one I was aware of but had chosen to ignore. He had done time for some petty crimes years ago, but Emma insisted we give him a second chance. She always had a soft spot for people like him, and I had trusted her judgment. Now, I wasn't so sure. I spent the rest of the evening pretending everything was fine, all the while, that moment in the garden playing over and over in my mind. Emma was a vision in her white dress, smiling for the guests, but every time she glanced at Marcus, I felt like an outsider at my own wedding. As she held my hand for the first dance, it felt cold, like she was going through the motions with me while her heart belonged elsewhere. That night, as we drove to the hotel, she seemed different, detached. I chalked it up to exhaustion from the day's events, but something gnawed at me. Even as she kissed me goodnight, it lacked the warmth and passion that once flowed between us. Instead, it felt like a duty, like she was with me because she had to be, not because she wanted to be. That night, as she slept beside me, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment with Marcus over and over. Was I being paranoid? Was it just a fleeting kiss, a mistake? Or had something deeper been going on all along? The doubts consumed me. The next morning, I decided to keep a closer eye on things. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what it was. That kiss in the garden was just the beginning. The weeks after the wedding were nothing short of strange. The tension between Emma and me only grew. It wasn't something I could easily point out to anyone else, but I felt it. Every time we were together, it was as if she was a million miles away, lost in her own world. I told myself it was normal. Maybe the stress of planning the wedding and starting our life together was just taking its toll. But the nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Emma was cold, distant, and seemed to be avoiding me. There were no more sweet goodnight kisses, no more long conversations in bed. We were newlyweds, but it felt like we were strangers. It was Marcus that weighed heavily on my mind. I started to notice how she would always be around whenever he was in the garden. She'd find some excuse to step outside, just for some fresh air, or to check on the flowers, but she wasn't checking on the flowers. She was checking on him. Marcus was not the type of man I imagined Emma would be drawn to. He was rough around the edges, brutal, almost intimidating. I had hired him a year ago, despite knowing about his criminal past. It wasn't anything major, just a string of petty crimes. But he had that tough, hardened look that told you he wasn't afraid to cross the line when needed. Still, he had been reliable in his work. Emma had defended him passionately when I had my doubts about keeping him on, and I trusted her opinion. But now, things were different. Emma wasn't just defending him. She was clinging to him in ways that didn't make sense. When they were together, she would laugh, really laugh, the way she used to with me. She seemed comfortable, even happy, in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Around Marcus, she was alive, and around me, she was cold, almost robotic. One evening, after another fight about my long work hours, Emma stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I watched from the window as she headed into the garden, where Marcus was working late. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I knew where she was going. I stood there in the shadows of our home, watching as she approached him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way she touched his arm, the way she leaned into him, it was intimate. It was familiar. Something had shifted between them, and I was no longer just a paranoid husband. I was sure of it now. There was more to their relationship than I wanted to admit. They were far too close, far too comfortable. Emma no longer seemed to care about hiding it either. Her behavior around me had become increasingly indifferent, but around Marcus, she glowed. She had stopped pretending, and it was only a matter of time before I couldn't ignore it any longer. I confronted her that night, but she brushed it off. "You're imagining things," she said, her voice calm, almost bored. "Marcus is just a friend. You're being ridiculous." But I wasn't. The kiss at our wedding, the late-night talks in the garden, the way she looked at him, none of it was in my imagination. I tried to focus on work, tried to pretend everything was fine. But every time I came home, Marcus was there, and Emma was right there with him. If she wasn't in the garden with him, she was looking out the window, watching him, waiting for any excuse to go out there. And the more I watched, the more I noticed how bold she had become. There were small things at first, lingering touches, glances that lasted too long, but then it escalated. I would find her spending hours in the garden, well after Marcus was supposed to have finished his work for the day. I overheard them talking, laughing in ways that made my stomach churn. It felt like they were sharing a secret, one that I wasn't a part of. Every time I tried to bring it up, she would dismiss me, make me feel like I was crazy, paranoid. But I knew better. The breaking point came one afternoon when I found her sitting on the porch with him, drinking wine. She hadn't even bothered to let me know she was home early from work, but there she was, sharing a bottle of wine with the gardener, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. The moment I stepped outside, the laughter died, and the atmosphere changed. Emma got up quickly, brushing past me without a word, leaving Marcus to pack up and leave. That's when I realized I couldn't just let this go. I wasn't going to be the fool in my own marriage. I needed proof, solid proof. Something I could confront her with, something she couldn't deny. And if she wanted to treat me like I was crazy, I was going to show her just how serious I was. I hired a private investigator the next day. I had to know. I had to see it for myself. Whatever they were doing, whatever secrets they were hiding, I was going to uncover them. I wasn't going to sit around and watch my marriage crumble. If Emma was betraying me, I was going to find out exactly how deep that betrayal ran. And I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover. The private investigator, Daniel, didn't take long to find what I was looking for. I remember the first phone call from him clearly. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he told me he had something for me. My heart raced as I drove to his office, unsure of what I'd find but knowing deep down that it wasn't going to be good. When I arrived, he handed me an envelope filled with photos. I sat down and slowly opened it, my hands trembling. The first few pictures were of Emma and Marcus walking through the park, their hands casually brushing against each other, their faces relaxed and full of warmth. It was like they were a couple. The way she looked at him was unmistakable, a look I hadn't seen from her in months. As I flipped through the images, the story became clearer. They weren't just meeting once or twice, they were meeting regularly, walking together in public like they had nothing to hide. I felt a pit growing in my stomach. It wasn't just the park. Daniel had followed them to a nearby cafe where they sat in a corner booth, whispering and laughing. Emma's face was lit up in a way I hadn't seen in so long, a kind of happiness that used to be reserved for me. But now, it was Marcus who brought that out in her. The final blow came when Daniel handed me a set of photos taken at a hotel. My hotel? Emma had used my credit card to book the room, lying to me about a work retreat. I stared at the pictures, unable to believe what I was seeing. They walked into the hotel lobby like any other couple, hand in hand, smiling, without a care in the world. In one of the photos, Marcus even had his arm wrapped protectively around her waist as they checked in. It felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. The betrayal was far worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just some fleeting attraction or harmless flirtation, it was a full-blown affair. My wife, The woman I had vowed to spend my life with was living a double life with our gardener, using my money to fund their secret getaways. I flipped through the rest of the photos, seeing them leaving the hotel the next morning, looking just as content as they had the night before. Marcus drove off in my car. The car Emma had insisted we buy just a few months ago, claiming it was for her. She had bought it for him. I had been paying for everything him, their little love nest, and I hadn't even known it. The anger surged through me like a wave, but it was mixed with a deep, crushing sadness. I couldn't believe this was happening. How could she do this? How could she take everything we had built, everything I had worked so hard for, and throw it all away for him? I wanted to scream, to break something, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the evidence in front of me. It was undeniable now. There was no going back. When I confronted Emma later that night, she was ready for it. She didn't even flinch when I showed her the photos. She didn't deny it, didn't try to lie her way out. Instead, she just looked at me with a strange calmness, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "What do you want me to say?" she asked, her voice flat, emotionless. "It's been happening for a while. You were too busy working to notice." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I had been working to provide for us, to give her the life she always wanted, and this was how she repaid me? By sneaking around behind my back, using my money to fund her affair? I felt like a fool. She didn't care about the life I was building for us, she only cared about what made her feel good in the moment. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "Before the wedding," she admitted. "It started then, and it hasn't stopped since." I felt my stomach drop. Before the wedding? She had been cheating on me even before we said our vows. Everything we had was a lie, and I had been blind to it the whole time. I had married someone who had already given herself to someone else, someone who wasn't me. "I can't believe this," I muttered, pacing the room, running my hands through my hair. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Emma didn't answer right away. She just stared at me, her expression cold and distant. "You were never really there, you know? You spent more time at work than you did with me. Marcus, he was there. He listened. He understood." Her justification made me sick. I had been working for us, for our future, but none of that mattered to her. She wanted something else, something I apparently couldn't give her. "You destroyed us," I said, my voice shaking. "You destroyed everything." But Emma didn't care. She just stood there, watching as the weight of her betrayal crushed me. And in that moment, I knew this marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. I was done being her fool. And as I walked out that night, I wasn't sure who I was angrier at, Emma for her betrayal, or myself for not seeing it sooner. After that confrontation, I was a wreck. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my marriage, was crumbling around me. I had given everything to Emma, my time, my energy, my money, and she had used all of it to fund her affair with Marcus. The anger gnawed at me day and night, but underneath the rage was a hollow sadness that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their hands intertwined, their shared smiles. It wasn't just the betrayal that ate at me, though. It was how brazen it all was. Emma wasn't just hiding her affair, she was flaunting it. She used my money to shower Marcus with gifts. Expensive ones. I couldn't believe how far it had gone, but the more I dug into our finances, the clearer it became. It started with little things, nice clothes, small accessories, things I thought she was buying for herself. But then came the larger purchases. I remember the day I found the receipt for the car. It was a brand new model, fresh off the showroom floor. I'd thought the car was for her, something she had wanted to feel more independent. She had convinced me it was a necessity, and I, blinded by guilt over how much I had been working, agreed. Little did I know, the car wasn't for Emma at all. She had bought it for Marcus, using my money to fund the entire thing. I saw the paperwork, the registration, his name was on the documents. He had been driving around in a car I paid for while I was working late nights, trying to provide for a future that didn't even exist anymore. That discovery sent me over the edge. I confronted Emma again, this time armed with the receipts, the bank statements, the undeniable proof of her betrayal. But once again, She didn't seem to care. She barely even looked at the evidence. Instead, she shrugged, as if it was no big deal. "What was I supposed to do?" she asked, her tone casual, as if she were talking about a minor inconvenience. "You weren't around and Marcus, he needed help." "He needed help?" I repeated, incredulous. "You bought him a brand new car." "With my money." Emma rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "We share everything, don't we? It's not like you couldn't afford it." Her coldness stunned me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had married. This was someone else entirely, someone who had no regard for me or our marriage. She had checked out long before, and now she was acting like none of it even mattered. But it mattered to me. I couldn't let it go. Not this time. I decided to dig deeper, to find out just how long this had been going on. I knew now that it had started before our wedding, but I needed to know how far back the lies stretched. I hired Daniel again, this time to follow her every move. I needed more than just snapshots of them in a park or walking into a hotel. I needed to know where my money was going, how many times she had lied to my face while sneaking off with him. A few days later, Daniel sent me a new batch of photos. I opened them with trembling hands, unsure of what I'd find this time. The first set was what I expected: Emma and Marcus meeting in broad daylight, walking hand in hand through the park. But as I flipped through the images, I saw something that shocked me to my core. Emma wasn't just meeting Marcus in public. She was lavishing him with gifts. New clothes, expensive watches, even a custom motorcycle. And it was all paid for by me. The receipts Daniel had dug up showed everything, every purchase she had made for him, every luxury item she had gifted him, all with money I had earned. It was like she didn't even care if I found out. She had been living her life, giving Marcus everything he wanted while I worked tirelessly to maintain a life for us. I had sacrificed time with friends, weekends, late nights, all to build a future for us, and this was how she repaid me. The final set of photos showed them in another hotel this time, one I hadn't even known about. They were kissing in the lobby, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at the images, feeling my anger boil over once again. The detective had sent me everything: the dates, the receipts, even screenshots of their messages. Emma had booked the room under my name again, but this time she had added extra charges, buying champagne, room service, all on my dime. I couldn't take it anymore. Something inside me snapped. I was done being the victim, done sitting by while Emma and Marcus made a fool of me. I decided to get my own revenge. If Emma wanted to throw away our marriage, if she wanted to act like it didn't matter, then so be it. I had my own way of evening the score. It wasn't hard to find someone. Her best friend, Sarah, had always been a little too friendly with me. So one night, after I had seen enough, I went out for drinks and let things escalate with Sarah. If Emma could betray me, then I could betray her too. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming some control. When Emma found out, she was furious. But by then, I was past caring. Emma's reaction was explosive when she found out about Sarah. I half expected her to be indifferent, given how she had treated me throughout her affair with Marcus, but no, when it came to me cheating on her, the anger was immediate and vicious. She screamed at me, demanding to know how I could betray her like this, how I could stoop so low as to cheat with her best friend. The hypocrisy of it all was too much for me to bear. "You've been with him for months," I yelled back, my voice barely controlled. "You've been lying to me, using my money to buy him cars, gifts, hotel rooms. And now you want to act like the victim? You have no right to be angry." Emma's eyes blazed with fury, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is different," she spat. "Marcus is..." "What?" I interrupted. "What is he? Someone you actually care about? Someone worth betraying me over? You think that makes it better?" She faltered, the anger in her eyes flickering for just a moment, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. "You know what?" she said, her voice suddenly calmer, colder. "At least I never touched Sarah. She was my friend, but I never crossed that line. You're disgusting." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Don't you dare try to make this about what I did. You threw this marriage away long before I ever touched Sarah." For a moment, The room was filled with nothing but the sound of our ragged breathing. Emma turned away, pacing the room, clearly searching for something to say that would hurt me, something to gain the upper hand again. But for once, she didn't have it. I had seen the pictures, the receipts, the betrayal in full color. She couldn't manipulate me this time. Finally, she stopped pacing, her back to me as she spoke. "You never understood what I needed," she said quietly. "You never listened. You were always working, always putting everything else before me. Marcus, he was there. He made me feel alive. You made me feel invisible." Her words stung, even though I had expected something like this. "So you destroy everything we had because you didn't feel appreciated?" I shot back, my voice laced with bitterness. "I was working to give you everything you ever wanted, and you repay me by crawling into bed with the gardener?" "It wasn't just about that," she said, finally turning to face me. "It was about feeling something again. You stopped caring a long time ago." I shook my head in disbelief. "Stopped caring? I worked every day for us, for you. Do you think I enjoyed being away, spending long hours at the office? I was doing it all for you, Emma, to give you the life you said you wanted. You didn't even see me anymore," she replied, her voice quiet but sharp. "You didn't care that I was unhappy. You didn't care that I felt alone. Marcus, he was there when you weren't." I felt the anger flare up again. "So that makes it okay? That makes it all right to betray me?" Her silence was answer enough. She didn't see it as betrayal, at least, not in the same way I did. In her mind, I had driven her to this. In her mind, I was the one to blame. For the first time, I realized there was no fixing this. There was no going back, no mending the pieces. Emma had made her choice long before I ever found out about the affair. She had chosen Marcus, and now she wanted to justify it by making me the villain. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story that way. The confrontation dragged on into the night. We hurled accusations, insults, each trying to outdo the other in our pain and bitterness. But by the end, when the energy had drained from both of us, it became clear that this was the final act of our marriage. There was nothing left to salvage. "I can't do this anymore," I finally said, my voice raw with exhaustion. "I'm done. We're done." Emma didn't respond right away. She just stood there, staring at me, as if she couldn't quite believe that I was the one walking away. For all her talk about how unhappy she had been, how much Marcus had meant to her, it was clear that she hadn't expected me to be the one to end it. After a long silence, she nodded, her expression unreadable. "Fine," she said quietly. "I guess it's over then." There was no apology, no attempt to repair the damage, just a cold, resigned acceptance. In that moment, I realized that Emma had never truly wanted to fix things. She had never wanted to fight for our marriage. She had been ready to walk away from it long before I had ever discovered the truth. The next morning, I packed my things. Emma stayed in the other room, avoiding me as I gathered the last remnants of what used to be our life together. I didn't say goodbye when I left, and neither did she. As I drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and devastation. The marriage was over, but so was the betrayal. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The drive away from the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that settles in when something huge has ended. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, trying to contain the flood of emotions surging through me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the house fade into the distance, along with the life I had once thought was mine. The betrayal was still fresh, stinging in every corner of my mind. But beneath the hurt, there was a growing sense of freedom. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't walking around in a fog of uncertainty. The truth was out. Everything was in the open. Emma's affair with Marcus, the lies, the secrets, it was all behind me now. And as painful as it had been to confront, I realized that holding on to the illusion of our marriage had hurt far worse. The relief of letting go was something I hadn't expected, but it was there, unmistakable and undeniable. But as the miles passed and I drove farther from the life I once shared with Emma, I began to think about what came next. There was no going back now. The love we once had was destroyed, burned away by betrayal and bitterness. The woman I had married was a stranger to me now, and I no longer felt the need to fight for what was already gone. The finality of it all settled in, heavy but necessary. I found myself reflecting on the man I had become in the midst of all of this. I had been so focused on providing, on building a future for us, that I had let Emma slip through my fingers. In my attempt to make everything perfect, I had lost sight of what mattered most. It wasn't an excuse for her betrayal. Nothing could justify what she had done, but I couldn't ignore the part one had played in the downfall of our marriage. I had been absent, emotionally distant, too caught up in the grind of life to notice that the woman I loved had drifted away from me. But now it was too late to fix any of it. All that was left to do was pick up the pieces and move forward. I had no plan for what my future would look like, but I knew it wouldn't include Emma or the life we had tried to build together. That chapter was closed. A few days later, I met with my lawyer to start the divorce proceedings. I hadn't heard from Emma since the night I walked out, and I didn't expect to. The divorce would be clean, as much as it could be. There were no kids, no shared assets that couldn't be divided easily. It was almost ironic how simple it all was, considering the storm of emotions we had both unleashed on each other. But simplicity didn't mean it didn't hurt. The finality of it signing those papers felt like the last nail in the coffin of the life I had thought I would have. In the end, I walked away with more than just my freedom. I walked away with a lesson, one I wish I hadn't had to learn this way. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. I had trusted Emma with everything, and she had shattered that trust beyond repair. But from now on, I wouldn't let anyone have that kind of power over me again. The marriage was over. The betrayal had been exposed. And now, I was free to start over, to rebuild, piece by piece, on my own terms. The divorce moved quickly, and within a few months, Emma and I were officially done. It was hard to believe how swiftly something that took years to build could fall apart in a matter of weeks. But there was no point dwelling on it any longer. I had my freedom, and now, I needed to figure out what came next. My house, the one that had once been filled with memories of Emma, now felt empty. The echo of her absence was everywhere, but instead of sadness, it felt like a necessary emptiness, clean slate. After the paperwork was finalized, I decided to take a break from everything. I left the city, rented a small cabin in the mountains, and disconnected from the world for a while. It was the peace I hadn't realized I desperately needed. The days in the cabin were quiet, allowing me to think without the constant reminder of what had been lost. Slowly, I began to regain a sense of who I was before all of this happened. The nights, however, were different. That's when the memories of Emma would creep in, uninvited. I would find myself thinking about the early days when we first met, how easy it had all seemed back then. We were so in love, or at least I thought we were. But as much as I hated to admit it, those days were long gone before Marcus ever came into the picture. Maybe we were both at fault. Maybe Emma had felt neglected for too long, and maybe I had been too focused on my career, too absent to notice the cracks forming in our relationship. Still, nothing justified her betrayal. The anger would rise again in those moments, but it was no longer the same burning rage I had felt before. It was more of a simmering disappointment, not just in her but in myself for letting things get so bad. I kept thinking back to those photographs of her and Marcus, how easily she seemed to have slipped into a life without me, like I was just a shadow she had left behind. But I wasn't the only one to blame for what had happened. Her choices had destroyed our marriage, not my absence. One night, while sitting by the fireplace, I thought about Sarah. My decision to sleep with her had been driven by anger, a reckless attempt to even the score with Emma. I hadn't really wanted Sarah, not in the way I once wanted Emma, but in the heat of the moment, it had felt like my way of regaining some control. Now, it just felt like another layer of betrayal in an already complicated mess. I hadn't heard from Sarah since, and part of me was glad. That chapter of my life was closed too, and I had no interest in reopening it. When I finally left the cabin, I returned to the city with a new sense of clarity. I was ready to move on. My friends tried to be there for me throughout the divorce, offering support, but I had mostly pushed them away, preferring to deal with the aftermath on my own. Now, I was ready to reconnect with the people who had stood by me, even when I wasn't willing to let them in. The first person I reached out to was Mark, one of my oldest friends. He had known me long before Emma came into the picture and had always been a good judge of character. When we met for drinks, he listened quietly as I recounted everything that had happened. I didn't hold back, telling him about Emma, Marcus, the affair, and even the night with Sarah. He didn't judge me, didn't offer any cheap advice or cliches about moving on. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "You got out when you needed to. That's what matters." His words stuck with me. I had gotten out, and even though it felt like my world had crumbled, I had survived. I wasn't broken. I wasn't beyond repair. There was life after Emma, and for the first time, I truly believed that. As the weeks went by, I threw myself back into work. My career had always been a major part of my life, but now it became a way to rebuild. Every project, every late-night deadline was a step toward reclaiming what I had lost, not the marriage, but my sense of self. I wasn't defined by Emma's betrayal. I was more than what had happened to me. It was during this time that I realized something important. The betrayal, as devastating as it had also given me an unexpected gift: freedom. The life I had built with Emma had been a cage, one I hadn't even realized I was trapped in. I had been so focused on maintaining a life that didn't truly make me happy, so intent on keeping up the facade of a perfect marriage, that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I had lost in the process. Now, without Emma, without the weight of her expectations, I felt lighter. I could make decisions for myself again, without worrying about whether they fit into the mold of what she wanted. I began to enjoy the small things I had once ignored: spending more time with friends, taking spontaneous trips, and even picking up old hobbies I had long abandoned. It wasn't about running away from the past anymore. It was about finally moving forward. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, sipping a glass of whiskey, I realized that I had no regrets about walking away. Emma had made her choices, and so had I. We both destroyed our marriage in different ways, but now that it was over, I saw it for what it really was: a chapter of my life that had run its course. And with that, I was ready to start writing a new one. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The scars of Emma's betrayal were still there, but they no longer stung the way they used to. I had learned to live with them, like old wounds that ached only occasionally. The anger and sadness that had once consumed me were now replaced with a quiet acceptance. I wasn't the same man I had been before, but in many ways I was stronger for it. Emma and I hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized. She had moved on, as far as I could tell, likely still wrapped up in whatever relationship she had with Marcus. The thought of them together no longer bothered me as it once had. In fact, I barely thought about them at all. They were a part of my past, and that's where they belonged. I was focused on the future now, my future. Work had become my anchor, but it wasn't the all-consuming obsession it once was. I had found a balance, taking time for myself in ways I hadn't before. I started reconnecting with people I had neglected during my marriage: old friends, family, even colleagues I had kept at arm's length. It was liberating, in a way, to rebuild relationships on my own terms, without the weight of a failing marriage hanging over my head. One afternoon, while going through some old emails, I stumbled across one from the private investigator, Daniel. It had been months since we last spoke, but seeing his name brought back the flood of memories: those pictures, the long nights of suspicion and dread. I debated whether to delete the email or open it, knowing it would likely stir up things I'd long buried. Curiosity won out. I opened the email and found a message I hadn't seen before, something he must have sent after the final set of photos. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, just a brief update on some last pieces of information he'd uncovered about Emma's finances: more purchases, more evidence of her deceit. But it didn't matter anymore. I closed the email, realizing that none of it held power over me now. It was all part of the past, and I had no interest in reliving it. I deleted the email and everything else connected to that chapter of my life. With a single click, I erased it all: Emma, Marcus, the betrayal. They were no longer a part of my story. A few weeks later, I was out with Mark and a couple of other friends, grabbing drinks at a local bar. It was one of those nights where everything felt light, easy. The conversation flowed, the laughter came easily, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Emma or the wreckage of my marriage. I was just present, enjoying the moment. As the night wound down, Mark leaned over and clinked his glass against mine. "You seem good, man," he said with a grin. "Really good." "I am," I replied, and I meant it. "I think I'm finally getting there." He nodded, then hesitated for a moment. "You know, I always thought I always thought she wasn't right for you. I just didn't want to say anything back then." I laughed softly, not out of bitterness, but because I had come to the same conclusion. "You were right. She wasn't. But it's over now. I'm moving on." "Good," Mark said, raising his glass. "To moving on." We clinked glasses again, and as I took a sip, I realized that's exactly what I had done. I had moved on, piece by piece, day by day. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the memories crept back in, but they no longer controlled me. They were just echoes, fading into the background of a new life I was building. Over time, I began dating again, not seriously at first, just casual conversations, dinners here and there. I wasn't looking for anything, but it felt good to open myself up to the possibility of something new. The fear of being hurt again still lingered, but it didn't paralyze me. I wasn't the same naive man who had married Emma, blinded by the idea of a perfect life. I had learned, grown, and now I knew better. I knew to trust myself, to set boundaries, and to recognize when something was worth fighting for. One evening, I met a woman named Sophie at a friend's gathering. She was different from Emma in almost every way, grounded, confident, and unafraid to speak her mind. There was no pretense with her, no games. We talked for hours that night, and for the first time, I felt a spark of something real. I didn't dive into it headfirst like I had with Emma. I took my time, letting things unfold naturally. And for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about where things might go. The next few months were a slow but steady progression. Sophie and I began seeing each other more regularly, and while I was careful not to rush anything, I couldn't deny the connection we had. It wasn't like what I had with Emma. It wasn't built on illusion or pressure to be perfect. It was real, raw, and honest. As I stood in my kitchen one evening, cooking dinner for Sophie, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the broken man I had been when Emma's betrayal first shattered my world. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, and now I was finally at peace. Emma's betrayal had once defined me, but now it was just a part of my story, a chapter that had ended, paving the way for something better. I wasn't afraid of love anymore. I wasn't afraid of starting over. And as Sophie walked into the kitchen, smiling at me, I knew that this time I would get it right.